that definitely resonated with Brian. I think the thing with Cage's works like Inner Landscape is that although it was a system piece, it was created using formal devices, its sound does have a kind of romantic quality and a lyrical quality. And I think with Brian being brought up with rock and roll records and you know, the doo-wop and Elvis Presley, I think melody has always been something that's been important to him, and there's something that's kind of seeped into his work, even at its most austere and ambient. He's a melodist.
With Cage, Eno became intrigued by the potential of music as a creative artistic medium. Yet his lack of any training presented a seemingly impenetrable barrier to this realm. His discovery, again through tutor Tom Phillips, of the American experimental composer Steve Reich, was therefore life-changing. A pioneer, along with fellow Americans Terry Riley and Philip Glass, of a musical style that would later be termed minimalism, Reich was a formally trained composer who in the mid-1960s began to use tape recorders as his instrument of choice.
I never stopped saying that without Steve Reich I probably wouldn't have had an interesting composing career. You know, it was very much to do with ideas from his early work.
He was a kind of a well-educated composer in the traditional sense, but he had this vision of a kind of creating a modern compositional mode that was inspired as much by jazz and Motown, the sort of steady beat of Motown, as it was more avant-garde influences like Terry Riley, for example, who made tape recorder music out in California, experiments with multiple tape recorders in sequence and so forth. And Reich used tape recorders to make two significant pieces in the mid-60s called Come Out and It's Gonna Rain, both using recordings of speeches, editing them down into small cells of repetition and then running the tapes together to gradually, slowly separate the two recordings. And so you get this synchronized stereophonic quality that gradually goes out of phase. And this was the first of many phase experiments. The influence on Brian was obvious. You could use a tape recorder to make, you know, significant pieces of art music. To have someone like Steve Reich, Terry Riley, these mysterious avant-garde figures from across the Atlantic, making legitimate music. You know, they were composers. They weren't just dabblers. They were composers, but they'd chosen to use things like tape recorders to make avant-garde music. And together with, you know, with the imprimatur of John Cage, this kind of, I think, just sort of emulsified in Eno as a something he could do, and I think he went at it with some gusto after that.
The influences he discovered during his time at art school weren't simply musical, however. Just as Tom Phillips had introduced Eno to essential composers, the school head Roy Ascott exposed him to a new theoretical discipline called Cybernetics, and this too would be key to Eno's artistic approach.
I think that Eno derived a lot of very powerful ideas, especially out of this one book by Stafford Beer called The Brain of the Firm. Cybernetics is a way of kind of whole systems thinking, a way of conceptualizing the whole organism, and it can be applied to so many different fields. So engineering, science, business, which is something that Stafford Beer did. He sort of applied it to management. You know, anything that you can conceptualize as a system. Key to cybernetics is the idea of control and a feedback loop. These are ideas that can be pretty readily applied to music, especially to electronic music and the kind of stuff that Brian Eno is really interested in.
What Eno recognised in cybernetics was a means whereby a system could be put in place that, despite the random elements, was autonomous and looked after itself. I mean, in Brain of the Firm, Stafford Beer writes about organising management processes for places of work. And to Brian's credit, I think it's quite a conceptual leap to say, how do I apply that to art and music?
This whole idea of cybernetics would dominate Eno's life until now. I mean, it's where everything comes from, where the oracle cards, where the maxims, honor the errors, the hidden intention, where the whole idea of you set the process up, let it run for itself, ambient music, the whole idea of working with Bowie, of working in studios and letting things just happen. This kind of still an anarchic thing. I think it was because Eno had really got into machines. He wasn't really a musician, but he could work with tape recorder, he could fiddle with electronics, because he could actually interface with machines. That any kind of machine kind of philosophy would appeal to him.
All these significant influences gathered during art school were then brought to the fore upon Eno's development of his own career in mid-1973. Yet before attempting a traditional solo record, he returned to work he had begun the previous year while still a member of Roxy. Recordings that drew heavily upon the tape compositions of Steve Reich. Through his social and musical escapades, Eno had met Robert Fripp, the guitarist and founding member of prog rock giants King Crimson. Together, the pair began working on experimental recordings in September 1972. Yet these were shelved due to their other commitments. After his departure from Roxy Music, Eno returned to these experiments and found that Fripp had become similarly disillusioned by his day job and was more than happy to participate.
Fripp had great difficulty with King Crimson. The first King Crimson had imploded after an American tour. The whole energy of the band that had made it in the chord just dissipated into rancor, arguments, and people walking out. The most important being Greg Lake, the bass player, who then joined Emerson, Lake and Palmer. And so Fripp was really at a loose end. He wanted to make another record, but he didn't have a band really.
Eno and Fripp were this really incredible working team. They had a real intuition for each other, and in a certain way, they were like completely different people. Fripp was very much more technical, much more a real guitar virtuoso. Meanwhile, Eno was calling himself a non-musician. You know, so they really bounced off each other in a very special way. They were like a perfect pair because in a lot of ways they were so opposite to each other. In other ways, Eno and Fripp were very similar to each other. Fripp had sort of fled King Crimson. Eno had left Roxy Music. They had both left these very successful bands to break off and do something new. And they both were very interested in sort of pushing the limits of the music of the time.
The work, completed in August 1973, relied heavily on the tape system that Eno had developed, which through delay created a multi-layered wash of repeated and receding moments. Although Steve Reich had been pivotal in Eno's recognition of the potential of the tape recorder, another towering figure of the American avant-garde was perhaps even more inspirational on this experiment.
Well, I think the more close technological borrowing is Terry Riley. Poppy No-Good in the Phantom Band on side 2 of Rainbow and Curved Air was the first time I know of the open tape loop improvising technique.